Hello and welcome back to our Building a Node, Express and Postgres API video series. Today we're going to be working through getting our configuration set up for our application. So when our application first starts, we'll have an area that is designated for preparing the configuration for our application, bootstrapping any configuration values that we need, and basically just getting everything ready to start. What we've got up here in front of us is just a rundown of what we'll cover off today. But before we get started with that, if you want to follow along with me, there is a link in the video description that has got a GitHub repository that you can use to follow along. And what we'll be working from today is the part to start branch. And if you check out that branch, you'll have all the code up to what we've done so far, which is installing all the packages that we need, and you'll have the to-do list that we've got here, which is going to be what we'll focus on today. Before we get started, we'll have a look at the env file which we'll be creating today. And that's going to be a file that is used in conjunction with the .env package that we installed previously to provide our application environment variables that it can use to form part of its configuration. Now, when we create a .env file, we simply add a file called .env at the root of our project, and this file essentially is a key value store for variables that you want to pass into your application. It'll become a little bit clearer when we start working through this, how it actually all comes together. But what we'll do first is we'll define a few variables that we're going to use throughout our application. So the first one that we'll use is an env variable. Now this is just a variable that is used to determine whether your application is running on your local machine, which would be denoted by the dev environment, or whether it's running live, which would be like a prod environment. There are other types of environments you could have, like a UAT environment or a testing environment as well. So this is just useful for if you want your application to perform differently depending on whether you're in production or development. Another environment variable that we'll make use of as well is express port. So what this does is this tells your application, or Express specifically, which port to expose as the port to listen to when our application starts up. Next, we'll add a secret value. Now, a secret value is just going to be something that we use in conjunction with any services like when we're going to start to hash our passwords to store them so they're not stored in plain text. We'll use a secret value in conjunction with a hashing mechanism to make sure that our passwords are nice and secure. And then finally, we'll use the API. We'll have an API URL variable, which will be used in conjunction with our testing to tell us which URL we can hit with our requests to get a response. So for this example, we're going to be running everything on our local machine, so that's uses http://localhost, and then the express port after that, so it's 3000. So what you'll notice, and now that we've got our environment variable saved, file saved, is it actually shows up as grey, and that's because it's included in a .gitignore file. And the reason behind that is typically you'll have sensitive information stored in your .env file. So you might have something like an Amazon Web Services access key or something like that, which is obviously something that you need to keep private and not have published anywhere. So you don't want to be sending that to GitHub. So what you do when you're working with environment variable files like this is you'll have a .env file, which is the env file that you'll be using locally, and then you'll have a .env.example file, which you'll typically leave pre-filled with any variables that are not sensitive. But if you were to also have like an AWS access key ID, you typically just leave it blank so that people know that variable is required, but it's not one you're passing, you're keeping with your example file. And this example file is perfectly fine to have up on GitHub, so that people know roughly what they need to provide to get the application started. So with that out of the way, let's head back to our to-do list. We've got our environment variable file set up. We're going to add our basic configuration next. So with the configuration, what I typically like to do for different areas of our application is we'll split them up into domains of concern. So configuration would be its own domain because it's concerned just with the configuration of the application. So I'll add a domain subfolder. We'll add another folder called config, and within there we'll have an index.js file. So first things first, when your application is starting up and you're creating your config, that's going to be pretty much the first thing that happens within your application. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to initialize .env, because .env will focus or be one of the key aspects of providing environment variables for our configuration file. So we'll go ahead and we'll do const.env equals require .env, and then we'll have .env.config. And what this does, if you hover over, you should be able to see, but it essentially converts .env context files into variables associated with the process.env. So to give you an example, we've got a process, we've got an env variable here. So after we add in this .env.config here, when we try to access process.env.env, we'll actually have the environment variable that we declared there. What we're also going to do is we're going to create a config variable, and we are then going to start building out the variables that we're going to be passing into our application. So what we're actually going to do is just grab these from here, do this, and what this config variable is going to be used for is we can export this so that other parts of our application can import it and use the variables that are passed into it. So we know that we can access these variables from the process.env like this. Same with the express port. Secret, and then finally the API URL. I'll just put that one there. So one thing to be aware of, whenever we provide anything via an env file, they'll always be passed in as strings. So what we'll actually need to do is pass the integer from this particular string, and we know it's going to be something that's passed with the radix of 10. So we'll create this, and then what we'll do is we'll create an exports object here, and we'll just add our configuration to the exports. So that will set up a configuration object for us, which is great. But what we'll also want to do, because our application can't really function and work properly without most of these variables being passed into it. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to create a helper function that is going to be responsible for validating that these environment variables have actually been passed into the application as we're expecting. So what we'll do is we'll create just a new function that's going to be called validate env provided config. So it should be a really simple or really easy to understand name for the actual process or what this function actually does. And what we're going to do is we'll just grab each of these variables a second, because these are the ones that we know are going to be or should be available when we pass our environment variable. So we'll we'll just create a new variable called required config variables, and we'll just store these as strings for later use. Like this. And then what we're going to do is we're going to want to iterate through these variables, and we're going to want to assert that they exist on the process.env, which is a fairly simple process, but we're also going to want to keep track of which config variables aren't actually passed in. So we'll create a new variable called missing config variables, and we'll just create that or initialize that just as an empty array that we can start to work with. And then all we have to do is we'll just do a for loop which says for required config variable of required config variables, and then we'll say if the process.env and then config variable. If that doesn't exist, which can be denoted by this exclamation mark at the start of it, then what we want to do is we'll push that particular value into this array. So we'll just that array.push, and then we'll put the required config variable. So just from reading through this top to bottom, it's quite easy to follow along. We've got a list of required variables, we've got a list of an array of required variables, an array of missing variables. We're iterating over all of the required variables. If it's missing, putting it in there for that missing. And now all we need to do is actually make use of that missing config variables array, and then we can provide some really useful hints as to what's going on with the application, and take some steps to help somebody that's trying to start up the application if it's not working for any reason. So what we'll do is got the const there, for const, and then we'll have for const missing configuration variable of missing configuration variables. Actually, before we do that, if missing configuration variables dot length is does not equal 0, then what we'll do is we'll actually just do a simple console.error, and we'll just say missing environment variables in config. And then what we'll do for each of the missing environment variables, we'll just do a console.error, error, and we'll make it so that we can interpolate a value into here, missing variable, and then we'll just pass in the name of the variable that's missing. And what this will do is, if we try to start our application and we run this function, and if any of these variables are missing from the .env file, then this will come up and it'll say there's missing environment variables. It'll explicitly say which variables are missing, and if that's the case, then what we actually want to do is exit the application. Now, it's entirely up to you whether you feel it's required to exit the application at this point. Personally, I tend to find if we're missing environment variable configurations, there's a chance that if we start our application and it starts to run, it might end up running into an error because one of these isn't defined, or something will just go a little bit wrong and it'll be hard to recover from. So typically what I'll do is just exit the application as early as possible and notify people that it's gone wrong, and that'll give people a bit of safety that when the application is started up, it should run as they're expecting, as long as it's in the environment that they're expecting it to be running in. So that will give us our basic configuration there. What's left for us to do is actually create what's known as like an app starter, or what I like to call an app starter. And this app starter is actually what's responsible for going out, initializing the configuration values, and then later on in the project, it'll actually be responsible for a couple of other things like making sure that we've got a database connection available, and also making sure that we've got our HTTP server or our Express server started up as well. So what we're going to do within domain, we'll just add a new folder called startup, because it's quite an individual process, I guess, the startup, and so it should be its own self-contained piece of code. And what we'll do is we'll just add an index.js file. Now, what I'll do, it's entirely up to you whether you want to use classes or functions, but for the purpose of this project, we'll just create a new class called app starter. It's going to be quite a simple class. It's going to have a single static function at the moment, and static functions are special functions where you can just call, say, app starter dot, and you can access a static function that way. So our function is going to be called start services. So by virtue of it being a static function, you can then just call start services like that. And what this is going to do, what we'll do first of all, we'll just do console.log. We'll just say preparing environment variables, and then we'll call the function that we created in our configuration here. This validate and provide a config. We'll just make sure it's in our exports, and then what we'll do is we'll call this one here validate and config, and we'll just import that const equals require config. So what this will do is when the app starter start services is called, it'll log out that it's preparing the environment variables. Once it's prepared all the environment variables fine and that's all worked okay, then we'll just do another log here that says all services started for application. And what this will do is just say everything started okay, and at this point here the application should be up and running and you should be good to go. All that's left for us to do is just wire up this app starter into our index file, so we can get rid of everything that we had here, and we can just call app starter dot start services, and then we'll just import this at the top of the file. And this is in domain startup. So what we have now, so there's a few parts of this, and I'm conscious that we've kind of gone through a few bits in quick succession. So what we have, just to re-evaluate, when our application starts, it'll reach out to this app starter start services, and what that app starter will do, I'll just make sure this is exported. What that app starter will do and what it's responsible for is starting all of the services, validating that the configuration that we passed in is available and accurate, and then later on it'll be responsible for starting up some other services as well. And within our configuration here, what we have is a system that will check that all of the configuration is available from the services that we're using, mainly .env, and it will export a configuration object that the rest of our services can use when we're configuring other parts of our application, like our Express server and our tests and things like that. So what we should have, all being well, when we now start our application with just using node, source app, and then index.js, we should have preparing environment variables and then all services started for application, which is just coming out of our app starter. What I'll do just to kind of show you what happens when somebody comes to the project and we don't have an environment set up. Just delete that one a second. So what should happen when we run this now is we'll get a nice statement here just saying preparing environment variables, and then it'll say that it's missing all of these variables, and the process will exit with a code of 1, which if you're running it with any other services will actually highlight that it's not a standard exit and that it's actually an exit that's been caused by an error. So I'll just keep everything up to date with everything that's going on in your application, and should make it easier to troubleshoot what's going on. So we'll just add that environment variable back in, and we can see that our application will start up okay. So that's all that we needed to do for today's video. Next, what we'll have a look at doing is sorting out some unit tests for the configuration and the startup, just so that we can go through and assert that these are working exactly as we expect. So I'll see you in the next video.